It's kind of interesting that here, Stephen Woodford, our Rationality Rules host, and the person whom he's going to be citing and bringing on the program, Joshua Bowen, they are both appalled that I'm bringing LeBron James into this and referring to this language of trading and owning and selling and so forth, as though LeBron James is just on the same level as an Israelite servant. My point here is that, and they spent a lot of time, I should say, they spent a lot of time saying, oh, I can't believe Paul Copan would say these sorts of things. This is just outrageous. They're missing my point.
Really, Paul? Is that all we had to say? I mean, here's just a small clip of me alone saying a whole lot more. Equating beating a slave to such an extent that they can't work for a day or two against benching an NBA player is a gross oversimplification and false equivalence. Aside from the obvious issue of physical harm, an NBA player willingly enters a contract, gets paid handsomely, and has rights and agency. Slaves, on the other hand, lack autonomy. They could well have been extorted or even forced into their contract. They are property, bought, sold, and disciplined at the whim of their owner. Well, damn, Paul. It seems that we weren't merely moaning, were we? LeBron James enters into a contract that elevates him to immense wealth and adoration. Meanwhile, the foreign slaves of ancient Israel entered into no such agreement, did they? Instead of owning wealth and property, they were property.
They spent a lot of time saying, oh, I can't believe Paul Copan would say these sorts of things. This is just outrageous.
Yes, Paul, as lovely as you are, the words from your mouth are indeed outrageous. What you're about to see is a segment from Paul Copan on the channel Daily Dose of Wisdom, followed by comments from myself, Dr. Joshua Bowen, and Dr. Kipp Davis. Rest assured, our response involves a little bit more than mere moaning. And believe it or not, we go on for 3 hours, the full video of which is available now to all supporters of the channel. Thanks.
Yeah, and they spent a lot of time, I should say. They spent a lot of time saying, oh, I can't believe Paul Copan would say these sorts of things. This is just outrageous. They're missing my point. One, I said that there are harsh, severe, difficult things that people have to do in this agrarian society. It's backbreaking work, olive presses, digging wells, and so forth, as Stephen mentions later on in his video. I'm not denying that. I said it's tough. My point is not economic here. It's not talking about the economic level of LeBron James versus the Israelite servant. The issue is linguistic, and that's where they just really ignore that kind of a question. The issue is linguistic. This transactional language has something that brings together LeBron James and the Israelite servant, namely language of selling, language of acquiring, but without denying the humanity of the person who is traded, as it were, LeBron James, or sells himself or is acquired, that this is not denying their humanity.
Actually, on listening to this again, I think I finally clued in here on what he means by saying that there's no denial of the point is that the humanity is not denied through the language. That was tripping me up for the longest time, and I think I finally understand what he's saying here is that we talk about sports players using this transactional language, but that never detracts from the fact that they're still people and we still believe that they're human beings and we want to treat them that way. And now that I say it, wow, that's a dumb point. Like, as it's coming out of my mouth, right? So the problem is not, and this is so typical to misunderstand the problem. The problem is that slavery is about owning other people. It seems like apologists want to fixate on this idea that slavery is somehow about, in these more white supremacist sort of terms, like it's connected to this idea that anybody that you own as a slave is not human or subhuman at some point. That's a separate issue, and that has nothing to do with what's really going on in the Bible. The issue is that it's crappy to, have a system in which there's ownership of other people, where you remove somebody else's agency entirely. So, I'll start there. I have some more things to say here about this linguistic issue, because he's right about that as well. This is a linguistic issue, but not in the way that he thinks it is.
It's so ironic. I mean, like at a very basic level, epic fail, right? Like, and I say this every time I talk about, I like Paul, right? Like he and I have interacted. I think he's a nice guy. But like, if everybody's misunderstanding you, problem's not with us, right? So when it's even in the way that he said it, right? If you go back and watch the video, they're traded, they're sold.
Think of sports players. They are traded. They are sold.
It's like, oh, that sounds so bad. Yeah, it does. It does sound bad, right? And the fact that he's trying to make it seem like, well, hey, LeBron James is sold. So, I mean, like, what is that? Well, I mean, that's the same thing that's going on here in the Hebrew Bible. Like, that's the point. And if the argument here is that there's no loss of humanity, or the slave is not considered of a lower status, I mean, again, you're just wrong, right? So, I mean, this is the whole point. Bernard Jackson goes into great detail about this, as does Sam Gringus, Raymond Westbrook, any number of people. But like even in Exodus 21, there's the passage in 20 to 21 seems to emphasize the more family law, the greater humanity of probably a debt slave here, whereas 28 to 32 is probably talking about a permanent slave, a chattel slave, right? And that person is treated under property. That's the whole point, right? So this idea that there's this, you go back to, and he's going to say it, but like go back to Genesis 1 and you can see image of God and that just permeates. It's just it's just coming at the text from a very myopic viewpoint, right? And these are theological assertions that he's making here, not textual.
I think that's a really big emphasis because, I mean, Paul's a philosopher and many of the statements he's making here is trespassing on the ground of other disciplines. And that's, of course, fine, but you got to show receipts. You got to, it's not enough to be dismissal. So, adding to the points that you were just raising there, what amazes me is that he's made out here that the primary response that particularly I gave, and actually no, he threw you in this as well, Josh, is that we were incredulous. Like, wow, he would use such language. And this ironically leaves me feeling incredulous, because the thing is that we gave several objections to his analogy. We highlighted that, yes, because something has... You can't draw a conclusion from the fact that because something has one thing in common with something else, it's got another thing in common. It's like, yes, we use language in that way when we're talking about NBA players, but what you need to do is go down and look at, were they just using language like this? Was this just like the way that they use language back then? Or is it the case that, no, it is far worse than this, and it really is slavery? It's not like they use these terms because they're flavorful, or it's not like this is just the way that they used to speak. It's like, no, this is real slavery, full-on slavery. And that's one of the biggest problems with the linguistics here. It's one of the biggest problems with the language.
So maybe, shouldn't we be reflecting a little bit more on the linguistic issue here, the linguistic problem? So, this is an equivocation, right? He's equivocating by making this comparison using language as a way to soften our, visceral reactions to slavery in the ancient world. And in so doing, he's failing to grasp the real crucial, obvious point here, in that language is descriptive, it's not prescriptive, and importantly, language changes over time, which is how we are where we are now. We have this built-in language of sports business that employs these terms like owner, buying, selling, trading players and player contracts. But like, do they never think about where these terms came from? And are they never even just the least bit uncomfortable talking about a black athlete like LeBron James and his owner?
Yeah.
Like, how do you miss that? I think there's a bigger conversation to be had here about how messed up our language is thanks to slavery.
Mm-hmm.
So, like, the language of sports business developed out of, an earlier period before collective bargaining when, athletes were basically treated like chattel, like property. It was a soft form of slavery back in the 19th and the early 20th century, right? But that doesn't do anything but, I think, make this even worse.
And I mean, I think a very easy example of this, this fact that words are polysemous, or that like a single word can have many different meanings, but with, certain, you have a constellation of characteristics, right? And any word that, or any concept that is identified by a particular word will have like a small cluster of those characteristics that they all might share parts of that cluster, right? So, for example, the word run, right? My nose can run, Jackie Joyner Kersey can run, I can run. Those are very different, by the way. I can run to the store, my car is running, the refrigerator is running. There's a constellation of characteristics like moving quickly or moving fluidly, or and each of those words like will get maybe a small grouping of each, and some will get like all of them, right? Or most all of them. And that's the way that language works. It's the way that it functions. But that's why the joke works, right? Is your refrigerator running? We better go catch it, right? That's why it works, because words are polysemous. So in this context, if you go back to for example, like online apologists all the time will say things like, well, Moses was an Eved, right? He was a slave, right? Or Isaiah 53, the Eved, are you saying that Jesus is a slave, right? Or the servant is a slave? Is Moses a slave? Is Joshua? Yeah. The problem is that it's because you don't understand, those apologists don't understand polysemous nature of words, right? So in the same way that if you go back to the Amarna period in the 13th century, and you see these petty kings, these kings of like these little, regions in Canaan that are under Egyptian control, they're all referred to, or they refer to themselves when they write to their overlord, to their pharaoh, they say, your servant, referring to themselves, your slave, right? Does that mean that king, Ribhadu was like serving in the house of the pharaoh, No, of course not, right? But it's because there's a constellation of characteristics that the word Eved can kind of cover, and certain linguistic terms can be plugged in and capture a small portion of those or a larger portion of those that have commonality. So, but that's, as Kipp was saying, it's a sneaky sort of way, not to say that there's intentionality here, that he's intentionally being sneaky or something. Mm-hmm. But this is a way, intentionally or unintentionally, of softening the word slave. Because look, Moses was a slave, and we know he wasn't serving in somebody's house. So it must be that this means something different. LeBron James is sold. He's traded, right? So it must be that these words back here must also mean something softer. It's just not the case.
Absolutely. So another thing that comes to mind here is that we emphasized in our response to Paul that one of the issues with this analogy is the situation of a contract. So if you're an NBA player, you sign a contract, you get good money, they say we're going to take so much of your time, you're obligated to play certain games, and that's what you've got to do. Whereas when it comes to slavery in the Bible, if you're a foreign slave, there is no contract. You're just a slave. And when it comes to the Israelites, it's not, hey, do you want to sign up for this amazing situation and you come work for our team? It's, hey, I can see that you're in poverty and that you're in a state where I can absolutely extort the hell out of you. How about you come work for me? And it's just, it fails as an analogy to such an extent that I think it fails in a humanitarian sense. It's such a poor analogy. I don't know why he thinks this is a good analogy to put forward. He says, like, doesn't it sound crass? It does sound crass. It sounds like you're not empathizing. Yeah.